This is lecture number 6 in Introduction to Politics. I'd like to call this Democracy and Justice. Often when we think of democracy and the history of the origins and history of democracy, people think of liberty, equality, individuality, choice, agency, willing, conscience, and sometimes justice. And the meaning of justice gets lost in this. Certainly within the liberal democratic tradition, language of justice is very important. The dilemma, of course, when we hear the word justice, is what do we mean by justice? In the culture wars of today, we have social justice warriors whose concern is very much in what they see as the oppression of First Nations or women or blacks, many others. And so justice, this is how it's defined in terms of focusing on certain issues, the history of injustice or lack of justice for these people, and then overcoming that. And usually the police are the problems, or unjust structures, or political leaders. So justice, social justice warriors use the language of justice in that sense. If people are on the right, when it comes to, say, Dostoevsky and crime and punishment, within the liberal tradition, rehabilitative justice, transformative justice is often seen as a way of defining the victim-offender drama or story. But on the right, for their understanding, is retributive justice. Someone has committed acts of crime, so it is the role of the courts, which are meant to be embodiments of justice, to punish people, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, Shylockian pound of flesh in that sense. So justice, when it's seen in that sense, is one in which the offender has to accept the consequences of what they have done. Now, if a person comes restorative justice, they believe victim and offender must be brought together, and in that way, reconciliation and justice come together. You can't have justice without reconciliation, or peacemaking, or peacekeeping in that sense. And so, but a person's on the right, their understanding of justice is that the offender is punished. They lose their freedom because they have abused their freedom. And anyone who misuses freedom loses freedom, and that's the nature of justice. Another element of justice within a liberal democratic tradition is people who have experienced terrible injustices. And so justice is often defined as freedom from unjust situations. So it can be racism, it can be certain forms of patriarchy, certain treatment of First Nations peoples, working class people. So justice is a freedom from suffering. Now, the question that often has to be asked when we think of freedom from, and liberalism as a political philosophy and the democratic system as a political vision is often very strong on freedom from various forms of oppression, misuses of power, power politics in which you have classes of people who have the wealth, who have the power, oppress working class people, colored people, First Nations people, immigrant people, and so legitimately so, or situations of war, and people are fleeing from this, so legitimately so, people want to be free from these situations. And as I said, the liberal democratic tradition is very important on freedom from. The question that always is the next step, freedom from, freedom then for what? And so this is where liberals sometimes have difficulties articulating in a meaningful way the content of freedom for. Janis Joplin, for example, singer, very exquisite, powerful, intense singer, the 60s, says freedom's just another word for nothing left to do. And so the positive elements, so Friedrich Nietzsche once said, tell me what you want to be free from, and tell me what you want to be free for, and I will tell you whether you're just changing cages. And so often the dilemma of a liberal democratic tradition with its merging of liberty and justice. It's strong, rightly so historically, on freedom from many oppressive and historic contexts. But then was when asked free for what, this becomes an open-ended project in which people fragment all over in terms of the content of freedom. Because as soon as one begins to articulate the boundaries of freedom for, that's then seen as another oppressive um, form of thinking that hinders liberty once again. And so the relationship between liberty and structure, liberty and order within liberal democratic traditions is an ongoing tension. And where does justice fit into that? One of the leading liberal thinkers of the 20th century, John Rawls, wrote his great works on justice within a liberal democratic tradition and attempted to articulate that. That'll be in some of your readings. George Grant, significant Canadian thinker in the 1970s, did a series of lectures called English Speaking Justice, in which a high Tory tradition of justice, going back to Plato and the Greek notion of justice, dikaiosune, is compared and contrasted to the liberal notion of justice. So when we think of justice, then the question becomes not only at a theoretical level, but at an applied level or in the trenches level, whose version of justice? Who defines justice? Because no one in principle is going to object to the language of justice in the name of, say, injustice. The language of justice is like Boy Scouts and Girl Guide, motherhood and apple pie. No one's going to be opposed to it in principle. The question is, what do we mean by justice, and how is it to be defined and articulated both in theory, and then how is it to be applied in practice? And that is what often separates the right and the left politically. Neither would be opposed to the importance of justice. Their interpretation of justice, interestingly enough, Hermes was the great interpreter of the gods in Greek myth from Zeus. Hermes was called a trickster. And so Hermes is the trickster, and this is always important when people are interpreting either the liberal tradition, classical tradition. Inevitably, both sides see themselves as interpreting the best view of justice, but they're engaged in an interpretive task. And Hermes, or hermeneutics, one always have to be careful that Hermes is the trickster, and to take our interpretations with a little humility and little sense of ease and lightness, because we can often get it wrong. And Hermes is always to remind us there as the trickster that we may be being tricked in our interpretation of things. And so the language of justice and Hermes is very important. And so when we think liberal democratic traditions of justice, there are also institutions and organizations such as the Justice Institute. What's the relationship, as I mentioned earlier, between justice, liberty, and reconciliation, or peacekeeping, and how can that be done justly? When some people think justice, they think wealthy nations, wealthy people, and working class people. There's injustice in terms of class inequities. This is the Marxist, the social democratic, the democratic socialist perspective. So it's an economic term. This certainly emerges in full force in the 19th century in terms of soft left or strong left organizations. So justice is applied to the economic sphere. We get today social justice warriors, or also cultural Marxisms as well. And they will often employ the language of justice more in cultural issues than in economic issues. But again, justice is the term applied here. So justice is a polymorphic word. It's protean. It changes shapes and sizes based on context. And thoughtful people, as they're trying to make sense of this chameleon-like word, have to be careful, but always have Hermes, the trickster, by their side, So they recognize that if they're not careful, they may be drawn into one ideological tribe or another ideological tribe uncritically. And as long as Hermes is sitting on their shoulders saying, beware, be careful, that one is not naive and being taken in by the Pied Piper of some trendy view of justice, then the liberal democratic notion of justice can take on a more nuanced, nimble, thoughtful, engaging, and dialogical form.